I have seen 97 winters, and for more than 50 years, I've shouldered a secret as vast and silent as the wilderness itself, a truth no soul would accept, no matter how I swore its veracity. Between the years 1973 and 1998, deep within the heart of the Rocky Mountains, I encountered the same solitary giant near my cabin, time and again a friendship forged in silence long enough for him to reflect back at me the shadowed parts of humanity I now wish remained unseen. This is the story I've buried for a lifetime, a weight upon my soul that I can no longer bear. My name is John Mitchell. In the year 1973, I was a man of 45 years adrift in the fresh, raw sea of widowhood. My beloved Susan had been taken by that cruel thief cancer that spring, and our home in Denver became a mausoleum of memories. Everything was a testament to her absence. The kitchen, where the ghost of her Sunday morning bread still lingered. The porch, where the sunrise felt empty without her to share it over coffee. Even the very wallpaper, a choice she made back in '68, seemed to weep. So, like a character in some tragic novel, I did what any broken man does, I fled. With a modest inheritance from Susan's family and my own savings from years at the lumber mill, I purchased a tract of land some 40 miles east of Boulder, Colorado. It was a parcel of 60 acres, a wild tapestry of dense forest bisected by a babbling creek. Upon it stood a humble cabin, a relic built by some forgotten soul back in the 50s. It offered a Spartan existence. A single bedroom, a main room warmed by a wood stove, a necessary outhouse, and a hand pump that drew life from the earth. No wires connected me to the outside world, no electricity, no telephone line. It was the perfect cloister for a shattered spirit. I arrived in the high summer of '73, my '68 Ford F-100, groaning under the weight of my worldly possessions. My provisions were as simple as my new life. Tins of food, the steady glow of a kerosene lamp, a few trusted tools, my hunting rifle for sustenance, and a small transistor radio, my only tether to civilization, to the news, and the comforting rhythm of baseball games. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a sacred space encircled by Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their towering forms reaching for the heavens like the pillars of a great green cathedral. My nearest fellow man was a full 8 miles distant. For the first 2 months, only the ordinary wilderness greeted me. If you've ever found solace in nature, hit that like button. My days fell into a primitive rhythm. The sharp bite of the axe into wood, the patient mending of the cabin's roof, and the constant deafening task of learning to live with the profound silence. 23 years I had shared with Susan. In her absence, the quiet was no longer an absence of sound, but a crushing physical presence. Then came the 17th of September in the year 1973. The date is etched into my memory because it was a Monday, and the voice of Bob Costas had crackled from my radio the night before speaking of the Serena Williams match. But that dawn, I was torn from sleep by a sound that belonged to no creature I had ever known. It was a low, guttural lament echoing from the direction of the creek, perhaps 200 yards from my door. I seized my rifle, my heart a drum against my ribs, and stepped out to investigate. The morning fog was a spectral river flowing silent and thick through the trees. I moved toward that sorrowful sound, the crunch of my boots on the forest floor the only intrusion, and through the shifting veil of mist my eyes fell upon it. My first thought was a bear, a large one. The shape lay upon its side near the creek's edge, partially cloaked by a shroud of ferns. But as I drew closer to within maybe 30 feet, a chilling certainty washed over me. This was no bear. The creature was colossal, easily 7 feet in length, even as it lay prone draped in a coat of dark, reddish-brown hair. Its shoulders were a testament to impossible strength, and one of its legs was bent at an angle that screamed of violent trauma. It perceived my presence then, and with a surge of effort it tried to rise, only to collapse back with a sound so achingly human, a groan steeped in both agony and utter frustration. And in that moment of collapse I saw its face clearly for the first time. I tell you, I have relived that moment every single day for the last 52 years. The visage was a paradox, a startling canvas that was neither ape nor man, but some profound mystery in between. Its eyes, deep-set and dark as the forest floor, held a startling intelligence that rooted me to the spot. This was not the simple gaze of an animal sizing up a threat. No, it was studying me a profound and calculating appraisal as if it were weighing my very soul. My rifle was shouldered, my finger resting on the trigger. Remember, this was 1973. There was no internet, no endless stream of documentaries. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments. I was aware of the Mike Johnson film from '67. I'd seen the grainy photograph in a magazine once, but the world had largely dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. But, standing there watching this impossible creature's lifeblood stain the verdant moss, I knew with bone-deep certainty that Mike Johnson had told the truth. The being before me then made a sound not of aggression, but one that felt like a soft, vocal question mark. With one of its massive hands, it gestured feebly towards the mangled leg. 5 fingers I registered with a jolt. 5 long, thick digits that could surely crush my skull with no effort at all. And I lowered my rifle. To this day, I cannot fully explain the impulse. Perhaps it was my own crushing loneliness recognizing another's. Or perhaps it was the profound depth of history and sorrow I saw in those ancient eyes. But an act of compassion moved me. I returned to the cabin, gathered my first aid kit and a stack of old towels, and retraced my steps to the creek. The creature watched my every move, its breath hitching in short, ragged gasps of pain. Now, I'm no physician, but my years at the mill taught me the brutal architecture of a bad break. The lower leg bone, the tibia I believe it's called, was clearly fractured, likely the result of a terrible fall. I lacked the skill to set the bone, but I could clean the wound and attempt to stabilize it. For the next hour, I ministered to this 7-foot giant, and it lay perfectly impossibly still. If you find this story as incredible as I do, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a good mystery. It granted me its trust, allowing my hands to touch it. Its hair was far coarser than I'd imagined, more akin to thick wire than any animal's fur. And the skin beneath was the color of twilight, a dark slate gray that was almost black. As the peroxide hissed upon its wound, a sound like distant thunder rumbled low in its throat, yet it held its ground. I fashioned a rough brace from 2 straight limbs and a length of rope, binding the wood as firmly as my courage would allow. All the while, its eyes' deep pools of ancient night followed my every move, a silent, watchful judge. When my work was done, I retreated, stepping back with the caution of one leaving a king's presence. It rose with a slow, pained grace, its gaze shifting from the splinted leg, then locking back onto mine. A sound escaped its lips, a note of understanding that hung in the air, neither grunt nor syllable. Then it gained its feet, a towering tripod on one good leg, and limped into the embrace of the forest, using the ancient trees as its crutches. I truly believed our paths would never cross again, but if you think this story ends here, hit that like button because you're in for a surprise. 3 dawns later, a token lay on my porch. A rabbit, its life freshly and cleanly taken its warmth, still a ghost in the morning air. My eyes searched the silent tree line, the wall of green and shadow, finding nothing, and yet I felt a gaze upon me, an unseen presence. And so our strange covenant began. For the next 2 years, we fell into a silent rhythm, a wordless conversation. I would leave my humble offerings at the forest's edge, the cores of apples, the crusts of bread, the last of the evening's beans. By sunrise, they would be gone, and in their place a reply. Sometimes fish silver-scaled from the creek or earthy mushrooms from the forest floor. Once a gift of such magnitude, a deer haunch, it sustained me for a full 2 weeks. In those early years, I never saw my benefactor plainly. It remained a ghost in the periphery of my vision, a flicker of motion between the gloaming trees, a titan silhouette etched against a silver moon. The only proof was the rustle of a great body through the undergrowth. But I knew it was there, a silent observer in my solitary world, studying me just as I yearned to understand it. What do you think it was, learning? Let me know in the comments below. Then came the spring of 1975, a time of rebirth. I was splitting logs behind the cabin, the axe, a familiar rhythm in my hands when I felt it, that primal prickling sense of being watched. I turned slowly, and my breath caught in my chest. There it stood. At the clearing's edge, perhaps 60 feet distant, bathed in the full, unforgiving light of day. It was a giant far taller than my memory had served from our first meeting under duress. I'd place its height at 7.5 feet, perhaps even more. The injured leg my clumsy attempt at medicine had mended, though it carried a slight, almost imperceptible favor for the other. Its face was a map of the wilderness, weathered and wise, with streaks of silver gray dusting the reddish-brown fur of its muzzle and chest. We held each other's gaze for an eternity that the clock would have measured as merely 2 or 3 minutes. Then, on an impulse I still can't explain, I did something profoundly human. I raised my hand in a simple wave. The great creature tilted its head, a silent query processing this strange new signal. And then, with a slow and deliberate grace, it lifted its own massive hand and mirrored the gesture. In that single silent moment, a bridge was built between two worlds, and I knew my life had been changed forever. By 1976, a quiet understanding had blossomed between us. To call it friendship would be too simple, too human a word. It was more a delicate accord, a treaty of mutual respect between two solitary beings. It would materialize in the liminal hours of dusk and dawn, a silent sentinel appearing every few weeks, always maintaining a careful, respectful distance. I began to call it Shadow. In my private thoughts, for it lived at the edge of my world, a powerful presence felt more than seen. That summer, I purchased a Polaroid one-step camera from a hardware store down in Boulder. The clerk, a young man of maybe 20 with a haircut like Justin Bieber's, rang up my purchase humming along to some pop song that drifted from the store's radio, a tune full of summer haze and lazy afternoons. I told him it was for photographing wildlife. He suggested a new Kodak. Better for nature shots, he said. But I insisted on the Polaroid. A gut feeling told me that if I ever took a picture I would need immediate, undeniable proof. Proof for myself, perhaps, even if I never shared it with a soul. And yet, I never used it. Every time the thought of capturing Shadow on film crossed my mind, an invisible hand stayed my own. Perhaps it was respect. Or maybe it was a deep-seated fear that capturing its image would shatter the sacred, unspoken trust we had built. After all, the Mike Johnson film had only brought its creator a legacy of mockery and endless debate. I wanted no part of that circus. So instead, I chose a different medium. I began to keep a journal, a simple green canvas-covered notebook from that very same hardware store. In its pages, I chronicled everything: dates, times, its behaviors, my own observations. I have them still, 12 volumes now, a secret history stacked in a box beneath my bed. Shadow's intelligence revealed itself in small, breathtaking moments. In September of 1976, as I worked to replace the rotted planks of my cabin's front steps, one such moment arrived. I had set my hammer aside to measure a length of new wood. When I turned back, it had vanished. My eyes scanned the ground, then lifted, and there stood Shadow a mere 30 feet away. It held the hammer in its great hand, turning it over, examining it not with malice, but with the profound, focused curiosity of a child discovering a new and wonderful toy. I extended my own hand palm open, a silent request. Shadow regarded me for a long, quiet moment, then it closed the distance between us, stepping nearer than ever before, and gently placed the hammer back into my waiting palm. Its own was rough, calloused, like the hand of a man who had known a lifetime of hard labor. Its fingers were warm against my skin. We stood there separated by no more than 10 feet of cool mountain air, and for the first time I truly saw its face in the clear, honest light. The eyes, like pools of ancient earth, held a gaze more human than ape-deep brown flecked with amber set beneath a thoughtful, prominent brow. Its nose was broad and flat lips dark and capable of an expression that felt profound. Its face was a landscape etched with scars, old histories written by decades of a life lived wild and untamed. "Thank you," I whispered, a sentiment offered to the wild, not expecting it to understand the words, but perhaps the heart behind them. Shadow let out a sound, a low, resonant rumble that seemed to echo from the very core of the earth. Then, in a gesture that spoke a language older than words, it touched its own great chest with a single finger, and pointed directly at me. A beat of silence passed before the meaning dawned on me as profound as a sunrise. It was asking for my name. "John," I said, my hand instinctively going to my own chest. "John." Shadow's mouth moved a valiant effort to shape the sound, but only a breath escaped nothing that resembled human speech. Instead, it offered its own sound. 2 quick guttural grunts, a percussive beat from the heart of the forest, and tapped its chest once more. And in that moment, I understood. Perhaps it was giving me a name to use, or telling me it had a name my own tongue could never form. Whatever the truth, the name Shadow settled in my mind as fitting as the dark pines that surrounded us. And from that day on, it stuck. The late 1970s were a peculiar chapter for America, a nation holding its breath. Nixon had departed in disgrace back in '74, and now Carter was at the helm, navigating a sea of uncertainty that left everyone feeling a little lost. Gas prices soared to Olympian heights. I vividly recall paying 67 cents a gallon in 1978, a sum that felt apocalyptic at the time. Once a month, I'd coax my old Ford truck down the mountain for supplies. The soundtrack to those journeys was the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac spooling out from the 8-track player I'd wired in myself. But up here among the ancient peaks of the Rockies, time flowed to a different rhythm, a slower, deeper current. Shadow and I, we lived in a world apart, a sanctuary untouched by disco fever, the chilling whispers of the Cold War, or the distant crisis in Iran. Here we were crafting our own silent language, building a bridge of understanding, one glance at a time. By 1978, a new pattern emerged. Shadow would often appear at the far edge of the clearing as I worked a silent sentinel, watching my clumsy human efforts for hours on end. I found myself talking to it, my voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the wilderness. I spoke mostly of Susan, of the life I had forsaken, of the profound ache of loneliness. I knew Shadow didn't comprehend the words yet. I felt with a deep certainty that it understood the sorrow woven through them. On occasion, it would answer with those low, soft sounds, a form of primal consolation that soothed my spirit. It was in these moments that I began to perceive the first of its silent lessons. One sweltering afternoon in June of '79, my own foolishness was on full display. I was wrestling with my chainsaw, and after 2 hours of failure, my frustration boiled over into a storm of curses and thrown tools. Shadow was there, of course, a silent observer in its usual spot beneath the pines. As I finally surrendered to my rage and stomped back toward the cabin, it rose with a quiet grace and approached the defeated machine. I stood frozen, watching as it picked up the very screwdriver I had thrown down. It examined the tool with an air of intelligent curiosity, then turned its thoughtful gaze upon the chainsaw itself. It tilted its great head, a gesture of pure contemplation, and then attempted the very task that had defeated me, removing the air filter cover. But where I had used brute force, Shadow used a gentle, steady pressure. Slowly, carefully, the screw began to turn. I walked back humbled. Shadow placed the screwdriver in my hand and took a step back, ceding the space. Patience. I breathed the word, a revelation, on my lips. The lesson is patience. That familiar deep rumble sounded from Shadow's chest, a clear note of affirmation. Over the course of the following year, I began to see that singular lesson, patience, reflected in dozens of its actions. I witnessed it in the way it would sit still as a river stone for hours, waiting for the flash of a fish in the creek. I saw it in the delicate manner it extracted grubs from a rotting log, never rushing, never forcing its will upon the world. I watched it watch the forest, reading a silent text written in bent twigs and shifting winds, understanding the intricate patterns of nature that I in my hurried life had always been blind to. It was a silent tutelage, a master class without a single spoken word, and I was slowly coming to realize these were not merely lessons in survival. They were profound lessons in what it truly means to be human. Have you ever learned something profound from an unexpected source? Let me know in the comments below. Then, in the bleak November of 1979, a moment of profound weakness led me to a mistake that nearly shattered our world. I'd driven into Boulder for supplies and, against my better judgment, found myself at the local tavern. It was called the Mountain Lodge, a dimly lit den that smelled of stale beer and old regrets. I let a few too many local brews cloud my judgment. In my haze, I fell into conversation with some locals about the upcoming hunting season, and with a fool's tongue I mentioned seeing something unusual up on my land. Unusual how? A man named Kevin asked, his interest piqued. He was probably in his mid-30s, wearing a Peterbilt cap and a worn denim jacket. "Oh, just big tracks," I stammered. Strange behavior from the wildlife. I tried to backtrack, a cold dread washing over me as I saw a greedy light ignite in Kevin's eyes. "Bigfoot tracks, my God, John, are you serious?" In a small town, a story like that travels faster than a wildfire. Sure enough, within a week, 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed men rumbled up my private road. They spilled out with rifles at the ready, buzzing with talk of fame and fortune. I chased them off my land, my voice raw with anger and shame, swearing I'd been drunk and spinning yarns. They left grumbling, but the sacred silence had been broken. The damage was done. My careless words had put Shadow in mortal danger, and, as a consequence, it vanished. I didn't see my silent friend for 2 long months. December and January bled into one another, a stretch of cold, empty days, with no sign, no tracks, no small gifts left at the edge of the woods. A heavy certainty settled in my heart that I had lost it forever, that the clumsy, loud intrusion of my world had permanently driven it back into the deepest, most unknowable shadows. If you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Then, on a February morning in 1980, a day etched in frost and memory, I awoke to find Shadow had come to me. Not near my porch, but upon it a silent sentinel perhaps 6 feet from my very door. I turned the handle slowly, my heart a quiet drum against my ribs, careful not to break the spell of the moment. Shadow looked at me, and in those deep umber eyes, pools of ancient knowing, I swear I saw something akin to grace. It was not mere forgiveness, but a profound understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that, as the poets say, to err is human. With a movement both deliberate and graceful, Shadow reached into the thick mantle of its fur and withdrew a small offering, holding it out in a gesture that transcended species. I bridged the small gap between us and accepted the gift. It was a river stone, worn smooth by the relentless flow of time, perfectly round and the size of a $50. It held a deep living warmth from being held close to that great heart. This was more than a stone. It was an olive branch, an acceptance. I sank onto the porch step, the weight of the moment settling upon me, and Shadow sat beside me. We didn't touch yet. A palpable warmth radiated from its massive form, a silent testament to its presence. We remained that way for what felt like 20 minutes, 2 solitary figures sharing a profound, unspoken peace. We watched the sun spill gold through the towering Douglas firs, a silent congregation in the cathedral of the woods. And in that quiet dawn, the second lesson crystallized in my soul: forgiveness is not a feeling that washes over you, but a conscious choice you make. Shadow had every right to vanish into the wilderness forever, to write off humanity as a chapter of pain. But it chose to return. It chose to extend the fragile hand of trust once more in defiance of all that had happened. And I wept that morning right there on my porch steps, the tears flowing for the first time since Susan's funeral. Shadow remained utterly still, a mountain of quiet empathy offering no platitudes, just a solid, unwavering presence. It just sat with me as I unburdened myself of 50 years of dammed-up grief. When the storm of sorrow finally passed and I looked up, Shadow was holding out one massive hand, palm open, an invitation. I placed my trembling hand in its great palm, and Shadow's fingers closed around it with a tenderness that belied their strength. We sat like that, 2 souls from different worlds, man and creature, both scarred by life, both steeped in loneliness. Both of us trying to decipher the language of connection until the sun crested the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. That was the turning point, the moment our dynamic shifted from mere observation into something far deeper, a bond of kinship. It became something I still struggle to find the words for, even now, 45 years later. The 1980s swept in a decade of change with Reagan in the White House. What do you think that bond was? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. MTV launched in 1981, and suddenly the quiet streets of Boulder were awash in neon colors, the air filled with talk of something called aerobics. I'd catch glimpses of this new world on my monthly supply runs. Young folks with impossibly big hair carried boomboxes on their shoulders, the whole world accelerating, growing louder. But amid the noise, Shadow remained my constant. By 1981, our silent meetings had become more frequent, sometimes gracing my solitude twice a week. Shadow had started bringing me gifts, enigmatic offerings I couldn't comprehend at first. Strange arrangements of stones, meticulously constructed piles of sticks, like cryptic messages from the wild. One day, I found a perfect circle of pine cones laid out in the clearing. I documented everything, filling my journals with sketches of these strange patterns, searching for a key to their meaning. As fate would have it, it was my neighbor Steve Harris who inadvertently provided the Rosetta Stone. Steve lived about 8 miles to the west, where he ran a small Christmas tree farm. We were the kind of neighbors who'd share a cup of coffee once every few months, a comfortable and quiet friendship. Then, during a visit in March of 1982, he proudly showed me something his daughter had created for school, an art project fashioned entirely from found objects in nature. And in that moment, the tumblers of my understanding fell into place. Shadow wasn't leaving random debris, it was creating art. So, the next time Shadow appeared on a cool April evening with fog weaving like spirits through the trees, I decided to try something new. I carefully gathered stones from the chattering creek and arranged them in a spiral, a timeless pattern upon a large, flat rock. Then I stepped back into the shadows of the woods and waited, my breath held in anticipation. Shadow emerged from the tree line like a figure from myth, approached my simple creation, and studied it for a long, silent several minutes. Then it looked directly at me, and I swear it smiled. It wasn't a smile of the lips, but a light, a crinkling of warmth that shone from deep within its eyes. It was a warmth, a shared amusement that had never been there before. Shadow then sat down and with surprising dexterity began to rearrange my stones, transforming my spiral into a new pattern entirely. It created a circle with lines radiating outward like a child's first drawing of the sun. When it was finished, it looked at me, an expectant air about it. A genuine laugh escaped me. "I see it," I said. "It's beautiful." Shadow made that low, rumbling sound of approval and deliberately placed one more stone right in the center. And that, my friends, became our new language, not one of words but of shared creation. I would create a pattern, and Shadow would modify it or offer a response of its own. We were holding entire conversations through art, through symbols whose full meaning might have eluded us, but whose significance was felt deeply by both. Have you ever communicated without words? Share your story down below. Then, in the heat of July in 1982, an incident occurred that would teach me my third and perhaps most jarring lesson, one that shook my very understanding of human nature to its core. I had hiked down to Boulder for my usual supplies and stopped at the new Safeway they'd built on Central Avenue. It was there, while loading groceries into my old truck, that I became an unwilling witness. I saw a venomous argument unfold between a father and his young son in the asphalt expanse of the parking lot. The boy, no older than 10, had accidentally knocked over a shopping cart. And for this small mistake, the father unleashed a torrent of rage, his voice sharp and loud, calling his son stupid and clumsy. The boy's small shoulders shook as he tried to hold back tears, his apologies tumbling out one after another. And I did nothing. "It's none of my business," I told myself, a hollow excuse that echoed in my mind the entire drive home. The memory haunted me. 2 days later, as I was splitting wood, Shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing. And what happened next? Well, if you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. Shadow observed my labor for a time, a silent critic in the grand theater of the woods, before closing the distance to perhaps 15 feet. It then retrieved a piece of wood I had split clumsily, all jagged edges and uneven grain, and held it up for my inspection, a flawed offering. Then my silent companion selected another piece, this one split cleanly in a single, true stroke, and held them in juxtaposition. In my mind, I saw a critique of my craftsmanship, a lesson in the vast gulf between failure and success. But then, Shadow performed an act that defied all my human logic. It placed both pieces of wood together with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, as if the broken cut and the perfect one held an equal and undeniable worth. A soft, guttural sound rumbled in its chest as it touched itself, then pointed a great finger toward both pieces of wood. The meaning of this simple gesture struck me with the sudden breathtaking shock of an icy river. Both were still wood. Both possessed an innate value. One was not rendered worthless by its imperfection. "You're speaking of that child," I said aloud, the words tasting strange in the quiet air, even though Shadow could not possibly have known about the incident in the parking lot. "You're telling me we are too harsh in our judgments of each other." Shadow set the wood down and made a gesture I had come to know well, touching its eyes, then sweeping a massive hand toward the ancient forest. Look, observe, understand. It dawned on me then that I was not the first. Shadow had been watching humanity for decades, perhaps even centuries. It had witnessed the parade of us passing through these rocky mountains, the travelers, the hunters, the hikers. It had observed us with the patient discerning eye of a Dian Fossey among the gorillas studying our complex behaviors. It had seen our capacity for breathtaking cruelty and for profound kindness, all our baffling contradictions. And from this Shadow had drawn its own conclusions. Over the next few years, the lessons continued. What do you think it concluded about us? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. In 1983, it led me to a scar upon the land, a clearing about a mile from my cabin where some careless soul had disgorged their refuse-old tires, beer cans, and the rusted carcass of a refrigerator. Shadow stood amidst the man-made ruin, gesturing first at the metallic blight and then to the pristine living forest that surrounded it. The juxtaposition was a silent, damning indictment, and a deep disgust was etched in every line of its posture. "We are a destructive people," I confessed to the woods. "We don't respect what we have." Shadow touched its own chest, then the ancient bark of a tree, and then the rich earth. The message was as clear as a mountain spring. "I am part of this. The unspoken lesson hung in the air. You have set yourselves apart from it." That was the fourth revelation. Humanity had forgotten we were part of nature's grand tapestry, not the weavers of it. This was August of 1985, and the irony was not lost on me as "We Are the World" played constantly on the radio. I'd just acquired a battery-powered cassette player for the cabin, and it was against this backdrop of human sentiment that Shadow revealed something that would change the very foundations of my world. If this story is moving, you please hit that like button to help us share it with more people. It brought another of its kind into the clearing. I was inside performing the simple ritual of making coffee when a new sound pierced the morning quiet. Two distinct voices in conversation. One, the familiar bass of Shadow, the other, a higher, more delicate pitch. Instinct, born of years of solitude, sent my hand to my rifle as I peered through the window. There, at the tree line, stood Shadow, and beside it a slightly more slender version of itself. This was no child. It was fully grown, standing perhaps 6.5 feet tall, cloaked in fur so dark it seemed to be woven from the night itself. Female. My intuition told me, though I had no way of knowing for sure. Shadow gestured for me to emerge, a slow, deliberate invitation. I carefully set the rifle aside, a conscious treaty of peace, and stepped onto the porch, my hands held open and empty for them to see. The two silent giants watched my every move. Shadow then uttered a series of soft calls to its companion, a language whose meaning was lost to me but whose intricate complexity was undeniable. The female remained behind Shadow, her posture a blend of deep caution and an equally deep curiosity. Shadow stepped forward alone and with a fallen stick etched a simple hieroglyph into the dirt, two tall figures with a smaller one nestled between them. Then Shadow pointed to the female, then to its own chest, and finally swept its hand in a grand arc towards the majestic mountains that cradled us. The meaning was elemental universal. Family. My silent friend was showing me it had a family. The female never ventured closer that day. After about 10 minutes of quiet observation, she seemed to dissolve back into the forest. But Shadow remained, and in the stillness she left behind I understood the profound gravity of what had just transpired. Shadow had brought its mate or sibling or friend. I would never know for certain to see me to offer living proof that not all of my kind were a danger to be feared. And that was the fifth lesson. Trust is the most sacred offering any living being can make, and to betray it is to commit a violence that destroys far more than a single relationship. It annihilates the very possibility of connection itself. I never saw the female again. Her fate remains a mystery, a question whispered to the trees. But that single profound encounter made me realize that Shadow's solitude was likely a mirror of my own. We were two exiles, each estranged from our own kind, each seeking a communion that our respective worlds could not provide. By 1987, I was 59 years of age. Time had etched its story on me. My hair was a landscape of gray arthritis had laid claim to my hands, and drugstore reading glasses were now my constant companions for writing in my journals. Shadow, too, wore the passage of years. More silver threaded its dark fur. A slight stoop had entered its powerful shoulders, and its movements had acquired a slower, more deliberate grace. One evening in late September, as the sun painted the sky in hues of fire and farewell, Shadow and I sat in our familiar silence on opposite sides of the clearing. I was reading a week-old newspaper delivered from Portland. The headlines spoke of chaos in a world far from here, a stock market crash they called Black Monday. Men panicking about futures built on paper. Amidst the quiet turning of pages, Shadow made a soft, questioning sound. I lifted my gaze to find Shadow gesturing at the newspaper, then back at me, its expression a portrait of what I can only describe as profound confusion. Money. I tried to articulate the word, feeling flimsy and strange in the mountain air. I said, "People are in distress because they've lost their money." Shadow just tilted its head, the concept clearly alien. I searched for an analogy. We use these pieces of paper to trade for what we need. Food, shelter, our tools. In response, Shadow rose to its full height, walked to the forest's edge, and returned a moment later bearing a freshly caught trout, its scales gleaming like 1,000 tiny mirrors. It held the fish aloft, a simple offering, then gestured to the world that cradled us, the towering trees, the clear water, the vast sky, and made a sweeping motion with its arms. The meaning was a poem written in silence. Why do you need paper when everything of true worth is already here? I found I could not answer. I possessed no worthy reply. Shadow set the fish down between us, a gift as always, and looked at me with an expression that bordered on pity. It was in that moment I truly understood the sixth lesson, and perhaps the most vital of them all. Humanity had constructed these elaborate gilded cages of value that had severed us from the very things that truly sustain life. We had whispered a fiction to ourselves for so long that it had become our truth that abstract ideas like money and status were more real, more important than food, water, shelter, and the simple grace of connection. We had tangled our lives in 1,000 needless complexities, and Shadow simply couldn't comprehend why. And, sitting there in truth, neither could I. I sat in the fading light, arthritis, a dull fire in my hands, with a decade of isolation as my companion. The late 1980s rolled into the 90s, and it felt as if the world was accelerating into an unrecognizable future. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. I watched history unfold on a small black-and-white television I'd bought at a yard sale powered by an old car battery. The Soviet Union collapsed into memory. The Gulf War ignited the horizon. Everything was changing, shifting, the old world order dissolving like a photograph left out in the rain. But in my corner of the Rocky Mountains, my life remained beautifully, achingly simple. There was the cabin, the forest, and Shadow. In the spring of 1990, I turned 62. My body kept a faithful record of the year's bad knees from a lifetime of labor. A persistent cough from too many winters breathing wood smoke, and hearing that was no longer as sharp as it once was. I started thinking about mortality in a way I hadn't since Susan died. Shadow was aging too. I estimated it was somewhere in its 50s or 60s, though I had no true measure for the life of such a being. Its movements had become more deliberate, each step placed with careful consideration. The silver in its fur had spread across its chest and face like a slow frost. We were two old creatures meeting in the gloaming of the woods, both aware that our time was a finite, precious thing. That quiet awareness changed the tenor of our friendship. Then, in June of 1990, Shadow did something it had never done before. It came inside the cabin. I had left the door open on a warm afternoon and was inside organizing supplies I'd bought in town. I heard heavy, familiar footsteps on the porch, and I looked up. I turned to see Shadow's massive frame completely filling the doorway, its form a dark silhouette against the bright day. It had to duck its head to avoid the doorframe. We stared at each other across this new, unspoken threshold. The cabin had always been my domain, the forest shadows. But now, here it was, standing in my kitchen, its wise eyes scanning my small world with an obvious, deep curiosity. It moved toward my small table where I had been sorting through a box of old photographs, brittle-edged memories of Susan, my parents, and our wedding day in the summer of 1950. Shadow picked up the wedding photo with a startling delicacy, holding it in its enormous hands, studying Susan's smiling face with an intense focus. "That's Susan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My wife. She died a long time ago." Shadow looked from the black and white image to my own weathered face and back again. Then it did something that still brings tears to my eyes whenever I recall it. What happens next is truly incredible, so if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button to let us know. Shadow touched Susan's face in the photograph with a single finger, a gesture so gentle, so reverent, and then it lifted that same finger and touched my cheek in the exact same way. The gesture was a bridge between two worlds, a language beyond words. It understood loss. It understood grief. In that single silent act, it told me it knew the burden I had been carrying all these years. I finally broke down. I sat right there at my kitchen table and sobbed while this magnificent creature whom most people dismissed as a myth stood beside me, one massive, comforting hand resting lightly on my shoulder. When I finally composed myself, Shadow carefully placed the photograph back on the table and picked up another one, a picture of me and 3 other men at the lumber mill circa 1968. Shadow studied it, paying particular attention to our easy camaraderie, how we stood with our arms slung around each other's shoulders, all of us caught in a moment of pure, unbridled laughter. Then Shadow made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a low sigh and a question. It gestured out toward the vast empty forest and then gestured back at itself. Alone. "You miss them too," I breathed, the understanding hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "Your family. Your people." Shadow's response was to gather all the photographs of me surrounded by others and arrange them in a deliberate line on the table. Then it pointed to each person in the photos, then to the empty spaces in the cabin around us, and finally pointed to itself, the lone inhabitant of the forest. I'm speechless. What do you think Shadow was trying to communicate? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and be sure to share this with someone who'd appreciate this incredible story. And that was the 7th lesson, one that struck me like a thunderclap. We are, as the poet John Donne wrote, not islands, yet we spend our lives building walls of our own making. We choose exile, convinced that solitude is strength, but it's a gilded cage, a beautiful lie. We were withering on the vine, Shadow and I. Both of us were living testaments to a stark truth that isolation, even the kind we choose for ourselves, is a quiet, creeping poison to the soul. From that day forward, the threshold of my cabin was crossed. Shadow would come inside, not always, but with a growing regularity that became a silent rhythm to our shared existence, and I began to keep a special seat for it near the door. It was a sturdy bench I'd reinforced with heavy lumber, a throne for a king of the wilds. And there we would sit, 2 worlds colliding in quiet wonder as Shadow examined my books, my tools, my little radio with a profound and silent fascination. It was November of 1991 when I finally surrendered. In town, I purchased a Polaroid camera, a newer Spectra system on sale for $79. For years, I had resisted the urge to capture this magic. But I was 63 then, and the shadow of my own mortality was growing longer. The thought of my story of Shadow's existence vanishing like a whisper on the wind had become an unbearable weight. So when Shadow next visited, I revealed the camera. It recoiled at first, suspicious of this strange, one-eyed contraption, but I aimed it at the cabin's interior, captured a slice of our world, and showed it the ghostly image slowly blooming into life on the small white square. Shadow watched, utterly captivated as the image materialized from the ether. It was like watching a ghost take form. After that, it wanted more. We took 3 photographs that day, the first of Shadow framed in the doorway. A silhouette against the day's dying light, the second a study in contrast, its immense hand resting beside my own, and the third a testament to our bond, the 2 of us sitting side by side on the porch, captured by the camera's own patient eye. I have those photographs still. They are my relics locked away in a safe deposit box in Denver, beside my journals, proof of a life I have shared with no one. Until this very moment, If you're as captivated by this story as I am, hit that like button to let me know you're with me. Shadow was enthralled by the idea of the photograph, this human magic of freezing time and memory. It would point to my old pictures, then gesture to the ancient forest outside, a silent question in its eyes. Why do you not capture the souls of these trees, the rushing creek, the stoic mountains? I confessed that I'd never thought they needed preserving. They are eternal, I told it. They are always here. Shadow slowly shook its head, a human gesture it had adopted from me, and led me out into the world I thought I knew. For the next hour it became my guide, opening my eyes to the universe I had walked past 1,000 times but had never truly seen. We saw a spider's web, a tapestry strung with the jewels of morning dew. It showed me the intricate slow-motion poetry of lichen on a boulder and the way the sun painted cathedral light through the leaves at one perfect, fleeting angle. And so came the 8th lesson. We capture the faces of those we love because we know they are fleeting phantoms. But the world we believe is a constant, and so we let its beauty pass by unrecorded and unremarked. What a profound mistake. But nothing is permanent. Every leaf, every stone, every ray of light deserves its moment of attention, of appreciation, of remembrance. By 1992, my strange and wonderful apprenticeship with Shadow had spanned 19 years. Meanwhile, the world beyond my mountain continued its frantic, buzzing evolution. Whispers of something called the Internet were on the wind. The phones in people's hands were shrinking. Everyone was abuzz about email. But that digital noise couldn't breach our fortress of stone and sky. What did reach us, however, was a different kind of tide, the growing flood of hikers and tourists. The forest was becoming a playground for weekend warriors spilling out from Portland. They came with their brand-new gear still smelling of the store, their expensive cameras hungry for a curated, pre-packaged adventure. Then, in July of '92, a new sound shattered the peace. A group of college kids made camp about 2 miles from my cabin. I heard their civilization long before I saw it. A harsh symphony of a boombox, careless laughter, and the sharp hiss of opening cans. For 3 days they held their court, and when they left behind a battlefield of trash and scarred several ancient trees with their fleeting initials. Shadow appeared the day after their departure, and I saw a storm in it I'd never witnessed before. It led me to their desecrated campsite and stood amidst the ruin, gesturing at the violation with guttural sounds of a pain I could only begin to comprehend. It was the wounded trees that seemed to cause it the most anguish. The deep, violent gouges in their living skin, wounds that might take a lifetime to heal if they ever did. I offered the hollow excuse of youth. They're young, I said. They don't understand consequence. But the look in Shadow's eyes told me it was not buying my apology for our species. It picked up one of their discarded cans and, with no effort at all, crushed it into a mangled fist of metal. It threw it to the ground with a gesture of pure disgust. And then it did something with a chilling, deliberate intelligence. It approached an unmarked tree, raising its mighty hand as if to inflict the same wound. It paused mere inches from the bark and turned its head to lock eyes with me, ensuring I was a witness. Then, instead of striking it, gently touched the trunk, a caress of profound reverence. The message was as clear as a mountain stream. The choice to create or to destroy is a conscious one. Those kids weren't ignorant. They were simply indifferent. And that was the 9th and perhaps the hardest lesson. Cruelty is not a byproduct of youth. It is a choice. And it's a choice our kind makes with a terrifying and heartbreaking frequency. We choose the scar over the sanctity. That day marked a turning point, the beginning of a darker chapter in our story. A shadow had fallen over our sanctuary as Shadow began to see more of my kind in the forest, and none of it was good. A tragic verse written upon the land, the refuse of careless hands, the scars of vandalism, the silent sin of poaching, and a cacophony that shattered the ancient peace. It watched, a silent sentinel, as its sacred world was invaded. If you believe these wild places are worth protecting, hit that like button and let us know your thoughts below. And Shadow could not fathom this human impulse, this Midas touch in reverse, a compulsion to mar all that we held. I had no verse to explain it, for I too was lost in the same silent query. In the year 1994, a chapter was written that nearly penned our final verse. A logging company acquired a tract of land a mere 5 miles south of my haven and began the brutal act of clear-cutting. For months, the mechanical scream of chainsaws became the mountain's lament, a dirge echoing through the hollows. The creek, once clear as memory, ran thick and brown with the land's weeping. The familiar spirits of the forest creatures I'd known for years vanished like ghosts at dawn. Shadow appeared at my cabin in March of that year, but it was a different being. The change was more than mere upset. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness. Defeated. He sat on the porch, and for the first time in all our seasons together, Shadow looked ancient, burdened by the weight of the world. It wasn't the slow grace of aging, but the splintered look of something broken. I took my place beside him, and we listened to the distant thunder of falling titans. "I'm sorry," I whispered the words, turning to ash in the air, utterly worthless. "We are a tempestuous species. We can't seem to help ourselves." Shadow turned, then meeting my gaze with the eyes that held a new and terrible light, a reflection I had never witnessed before. It was judgment pure and unyielding. For the first time in 21 years, Shadow was not seeing John Mitchell the man. He was seeing a symbol and emissary of all humankind. And in that silent courtroom of the wild, my species was weighed and found wanting. Shadow rose, moved to the precipice of the clearing, and without a single backward glance was swallowed by the verdant shadows of the forest. I did not see him again for 8 agonizing months. The silence that filled those days was a vacuum far more crushing than the hollow ache I felt after my Susan passed. At least with Susan, I held tangible ghosts' memories, photographs, the unshakable truth of our shared existence. With Shadow, a creeping doubt began to poison the well of my own reality. Had I authored this epic connection in the lonely pages of my mind? Had I merely painted a human soul onto a wild canvas that was only tolerating my presence? I was 66 years old, a solitary figure etched against the mountain's spine, conversing with a phantom that most of the world dismissed as folklore. Perhaps my sanity had slipped its moorings years ago, drifting away so quietly I never even noticed the tide had turned. The winter of '94 bleeding into '95 was a beast of ice and fury. The snows fell in heavy silencing curtains, and the temperature plunged far below zero, a cold so sharp it set your very teeth to aching. I spent most of January and February besieged inside, feeding the hungry fire, my woodpile dwindling, while the disembodied voices of talk radio served as a frail tether to a world of other humans. The logging finally ceased in late February. The snow was too deep, the earth frozen solid, but the quiet that descended was not peace. It was the hollow silence of a gaping wound, the sound of something shattered beyond repair. If this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It truly helps more people find these narratives. March ushered in a thaw, and with the melting ice it brought Shadow. I was hauling water from the creek one gray, listless morning when I saw him, a stark silhouette at the far edge of the clearing. He was gaunter than my memory, held his fur ragged and matted in patches, each movement betraying a deep-settled stiffness. We locked eyes across 60 feet of raw, muddy earth, a chasm of silence between us. I gently lowered the water buckets, my heart a hammer against my ribs, and I waited. Shadow closed the distance with a slow, deliberate pace, halting about 20 feet away, close enough to see the fresh calligraphy of scars etched upon his face and arms. Close enough to witness the toll those 8 solitary months had taken on him, and to recognize the same erosion in my own reflection. "I had lost hope you would return," I confessed, my voice rough with disuse. Shadow emitted a low sound from deep within his chest, not the familiar rumble of contentment, but a note steeped in sorrow. He gestured a sweeping, mournful arc to the wounded forest, then to himself, and finally his gaze settled upon me. Then he pressed a hand to his great chest over his heart and raised a single finger. One. Alone. The same. "Yeah," I managed, my voice fracturing. "We are the same. 2 solitary souls witnessing the slow vanishing of our worlds." With a weary sigh, Shadow lowered himself to the ground, and I mirrored him, heedless of the cold mud seeping into my jeans. We sat in that shared stillness for what might have been an hour, 2 ancient beings from different worlds bound by a strange and powerful thread, neither knowing how to sever it. At last, Shadow rose to his feet and beckoned for me to follow. This bond is incredible. If you agree, share this video with someone who would appreciate this profound connection. He led me deeper into the heart of the woods than my feet had ever wandered, to a place some 3 miles from my cabin where the devastation abruptly ceased. The contrast was a wound upon the landscape. On one side, the primeval forest stood a living cathedral, hushed and sacred, and on the other, a desolate wasteland of stumps like gravestones choked with mud and the splintered bones of fallen trees. Shadow stood on the very precipice between these two worlds, and laid a hand upon a colossal Douglas fir, a survivor spared by a mere 50 feet. It was an elder of the woods, perhaps 300 years old or more, its bark a tapestry of thick moss and ancient lichen. Then Shadow crossed the line into the scarred earth and placed his hand upon a stump of equal girth, its twin in age and stature, now just a ghost, felled and carried off to be reborn as 2x4s and plywood. Shadow looked at me, and in his gaze I finally understood Lesson 10, perhaps the most crucial truth he had been trying to impart upon my soul all these years. Mankind measures worth by what can be taken, by what can be consumed, by what profit it yields. We are blind to the inherent sacred value of existence itself. That tree had weathered 300 years of tempests, of fires and plagues, only to be dismantled into common lumber for the sake of cheap construction. It's because we're afraid. I voiced into the silence the thought, a fragile key trying to unlock an immense and sorrowful door. It's a fear as old as time, isn't it? The fear of not having enough, of not being enough. So we consume, thinking we can fill that echoing void within. Just then, Shadow unleashed a sound I had never heard, a sound that seemed torn from the very earth. It was a lament caught somewhere between a guttural growl and a keening, sorrowful roar. And then it did something that simply fractured my soul. Shadow sank down amidst the clear-cut carnage, a landscape of raw devastation, and buried its great head in its hands. It was a portrait of pure grief, not just for the fallen giants of the forest, but for everything. For a family lost to the mists of time, for the dwindling wilderness, for the crushing weight of knowing you cannot stop the coming tide. I sat beside Shadow there in the mud and the ruins of stumps, and we wept for the world together. Have you ever felt a moment of shared grief like that? Let me know in the comments below. From that day forward, the very texture of our meetings shifted. It was no longer a matter of tutelage, but of simple, profound companionship. We were two weathered souls adrift on the same fading raft, clinging to something beautiful that was destined to fade, both knowing its fragile nature, yet neither of us willing to speak the truth aloud. Then, in the summer of 1996, my own mortality came calling. A small heart attack, a whisper of the end, which saw me confined to a hospital in Denver for 4 long days. When I finally returned to my cabin, my sanctuary Shadow was there, a silent vigil on my porch. It knew. Somehow, it always knew. Perhaps it had come calling in my absence, found the cabin cold and empty, and felt the discordant note in the air. Shadow examined me with a profound, quiet intensity, then gently placed a hand on my chest right where I imagined it could feel the fragile rhythm of my heart. And then it did something that transcended language. It lay down on the weathered porch boards, arranging its powerful form so that I could lean back against it, a living, breathing buttress against my own frailty. We remained that way for hours, anchored to the world by Shadow's profound warmth and the steady rhythmic tide of its breathing. It was in that quiet tableau that I truly understood the final lesson. Lesson 11. The most profound gift any living being can offer another is not a solution, nor some grand wisdom, not even the promise of hope. It is quite simply their presence. It's the quiet willingness to stay to bear witness to another's journey without the arrogant impulse to fix what is irrevocably broken. By 1997, I was 69 years old, and Shadow was visibly fading from the world. Its movements had become slow, ponderous things. The silver in its coat was no longer a dusting of frost, but a complete winter cloak, and a faint worrying wheeze had crept into its breath. And I too was a failing machine. 2 more small episodes with my heart served as reminders. The arthritis in my hands was a cruel jailer. Some mornings I could barely curl my fingers into a fist. The world had gone silent in my left ear. The hourglass was nearly empty for both of us, and the knowledge hung unspoken in the air between us. Shadow's visits grew more infrequent, stretching from weekly to every few weeks, then thinning to just once a month. When it did appear, our time was marked by a quiet stillness. Often we would just sit in a comfortable shared silence. Sometimes I would read aloud poetry, mostly knowing Shadow couldn't grasp the words, but perhaps the rhythm, the cadence. Other times we'd take slow, deliberate walks through the forest, a pilgrimage to old familiar trees, saying a silent farewell to the world we had shared for so long. Then, in September of 1997, Shadow brought me a gift, something it had never offered in all our years together. It was a tuft of its own silvered fur, carefully plucked and twisted into a small, tight bundle. Shadow placed it gently in my palm and curled my own worn fingers around it. A keepsake, a tangible piece of a memory, a way to prove, if only to my own doubting heart, that this extraordinary friendship had been real. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick, "for everything, for your lessons, for seeing me especially when I felt invisible. If you appreciate stories like this, hitting that like button really helps the channel." Shadow reached out and touched my weathered face with one massive hand, a touch as gentle as a falling leaf, and made that deep, resonant rumbling sound one last poignant time. I saw Shadow for the last time on March 15, 1998. The date is etched into my memory, for it was exactly 25 years to the day of our very first meeting. I awoke that morning to find Shadow sitting on the porch, a great weary silhouette against the tender light of dawn. It looked like a ghost of its former self, gaunt, its magnificent fur now patchy and thin, its breath a shallow whisper in the cold air. It had come to say goodbye. I sat beside my old friend and we watched the sun spill over the mountains one final time. The forest we both loved was stirring to life all around us, a chorus of birdsong, the rustle of a deer stepping delicately through the underbrush, the lively murmur of the creek swollen and rushing with snowmelt. It was the symphony of life we had witnessed together for a quarter of a century. Then Shadow reached over and took my small, gnarled hand, cradling it gently within both of its massive palms. We sat that way, hand in hand, until the sun had crested the peaks and bathed the valley in light. Then Shadow rose with a slowness that pained me to watch and began its final walk toward the tree line. At the very edge of the clearing where the shadows of the forest began, it turned back to look at me one last time. It raised a hand, not a wave, but something more profound, like a benediction, a final blessing, and then it simply dissolved into the trees. I never saw Shadow again. For months I searched, I called out, I walked the familiar paths, but I found no body, no sign, no trace of evidence beyond the memories seared into my soul and that small tuft of fur I keep in a little wooden box. Share this video if you believe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps Shadow had gone deep into the heart of the forest to meet its end in solitude, as is the way of so many wild creatures. Or perhaps it had simply walked on a final journey until its legs could carry it no farther. I am 97 years old now. I finally had to leave my cabin in 2003 when my failing health forced a move into an assisted living facility in Denver. The cabin still stands, I'm told, slowly, surrendering board by board back to the embrace of the forest. The property itself is protected, now held in a land trust. It will never feel the bite of a saw or the weight of a bulldozer. And people often ask me, why tell this story now? Why, after a lifetime of silence, did I choose to speak? In truth, I wasn't waiting for the end. I was in a quiet meditation, a long and slow unpacking of all that Shadow had taught me across a quarter century. This is the wisdom he imparted. I believe what Shadow was trying to impress upon my soul was a truth about our kind. We have forgotten the art of being. Our lives are a constant tempest of rushing, a frantic cycle of consuming and taking, leaving no silence to simply exist. We cast such harsh judgments upon one another like stones from glass houses. Yet, beneath the surface, we are all just struggling to endure, each carrying invisible wounds. We have built a wall between ourselves and the wild earth, and with a terrible irony, we've named that wall progress. We've woven intricate webs of complexity and called the tangle civilization. We've conjured ghosts of value pieces of paper, digital numbers, and declared them more real than the sun on our skin or the soil under our feet. Within us lies the capacity for a connection so deep it could heal the world. Yet, we so often choose the cold comfort of isolation. We hold the power of stewardship in our hands, but instead we choose the hammer of destruction. We are born with an inheritance of wisdom, but we trade it for the fleeting ease of convenience. And yet, and please hold on to this, we are also creatures of profound change. We can choose another path. We can learn to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. If only we can find the courage to be still, to be quiet, to be humble enough to become students of a mystery far older than ourselves. Shadow did not hate humanity. If he had, he would have vanished forever after that day the hunters came with their noise and their fury. He never would have invested 25 years teaching a stubborn old fool like me how to truly open my eyes. No, he only wished we were more. Wished we were kinder, more awake, more tethered to the pulse of what truly matters. It's a wish I now carry as my own. If you feel that too, hit that like button to let us know. That small tuft of dark fur still rests in my bedside drawer. In the deep quiet of this nursing home, when sleep is a distant country, I hold it in my palm and I remember. I remember the impossible peace of sitting in that ancient forest with a living myth. I remember the feeling of being seen, truly seen by eyes that held no ledger of my faults, only a profound curiosity, a deep sadness for what we've lost, and a fragile hope for what we might yet become. If there is one verse you carry with you from this long tale of mine, let it be this: slow down. Look up from your screens. See the world. I mean asterisk truly. See it asterisk in all its fleeting, heartbreaking beauty, and find the courage to connect with someone or something wholly different from you. Learn that true worth is not measured in what you can take, but in what you can give and what you can revere. And should you ever find yourself in the vastness of the Rocky Mountains, in those hallowed groves where the ancient trees still whisper to the sky, I implore you, be quiet, be respectful, be open, because maybe, just maybe, you are not alone. Something may be watching from the shadows, a consciousness that has observed our fleeting human story for longer than we have been searching for it. Something that understands the truth of what we are, the glory of what we could be, and the tragedy of what we are choosing to become. Shadow taught me the greatest mystery isn't whether some creature roams the woods. It's why we humanity, with all our brilliant minds, and godlike technology, with all our claims of dominion, seem so relentlessly determined to unmake the only Eden we have ever known. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below. I am 97 years old, a breath away from dust, and I still have no answer to that haunting question. Please share this story if it moved you. Perhaps together we can start to find one.